To understand how a flood of beer could devastate an entire neighborhood, we need to rewind to London in the year 1814. It was a city on the rise and on the edge. The Napoleonic Wars were finally winding down, and while the British Empire was expanding overseas, life for the average Londoner was cramped, dirty, and brutal. In the neighborhood of St. Giles, just west of what we now call central London, the streets were narrow, the air thick with coal smoke, and the population packed into crumbling tenements. In damp cellars, many families lived below ground level, in basements stacked with straw, cheap bedding, and not much else. Water, back then, wasn't safe to drink, not for the poor. It was often contaminated and disease-ridden, so what did people turn to? Beer. That's right. For many Londoners, especially the working class, beer wasn't a luxury, it was hydration. Even children drank it, usually in the form of a weak table beer with low alcohol content. It was cleaner than water, and far more available. And where there's demand, there's industry. By 1814, Moe and Company Brewery, located right in St. Giles, had become one of the largest beer producers in the city. Their specialty, a dark, heavy ale called porter, brewed in massive vats that stood several stories tall. These iron-bound, wooden barrels held hundreds of thousands of liters of beer at a time. Imagine walking down the street with a towering vat of booze looming above the rooftops nearby, pressurized, aging, and quietly humming with potential disaster. No one worried about it until, of course, the beer decided to escape. They say history repeats itself, but what about the parts we forgot? Welcome to Echoes of History, the channel where we dig up the dusty corners of the past to uncover the weird, the wild, and the wait, what? Stories they didn't teach you in school. Grab your curiosity and maybe a cup of tea, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. It happened without warning. On the afternoon of October 17, 1814, a quiet rumble echoed through the massive Moe and Company Brewery on Tottenham Court Road. The sound wasn't an explosion, at least not yet. It was a crack, deep and low, like old wood sign under pressure. One of the brewery's largest vats, 20 feet high, holding over 500,000 liters of fermenting porter, had split at the seams. The iron hoops meant to hold the wooden staves together had loosened over time, unnoticed. And now, with nothing left to contain it, the beer made its move. The vat burst, not slowly, not politely. It exploded, and with it came a wall of liquid, dark, warm, and pressurized. The sheer force of the release knocked down other vats nearby like bowling pins. More beer joined the flood. Barrels shattered, walls trembled. In seconds, over 1.4 million liters of beer were unleashed into the brewery. But it didn't stop there. The wave of porter tore through the rear wall of the building, a brick wall, by the way, and spilled violently out into the streets of St. Giles. It wasn't just a leak, it was a tsunami. Witnesses would later say the wave was for meters higher than a double-decker bus, and moving with the momentum of a freight train, and it hit the surrounding streets with no mercy. Within moments, it smashed into nearby homes, small shops, and fragile wooden structures. Walls collapsed. People were knocked off their feet. Some were trapped in their homes with no time to react. Worse still, many of those homes were below street level. Families living in basement apartments had no chance of escape. In one cellar, a mother and daughter were having tea. When the flood broke through the wall, they were drowned instantly. Not in water, but in beer, elsewhere. The wave ripped through a wake being held for a 2-year-old child. Several mourners were killed either crushed by debris or swept away by the flood. And all this from a single vat. No fire, no war, just beer. The flood didn't just knock down walls, it knocked down lives. When the beer wave tore through St. Giles, it didn't discriminate. It crashed into the poorest part of London, where families lived in cellars and one-room hovels, already struggling to survive. And now, those rooms were filling with beer. Brick walls crumbled, wooden beams snapped. People screamed, some for help, some in disbelief. One teenage girl, Mary Banfield, was swept off her feet while standing in her family's yard. She drowned before her mother could reach her. Her brother survived only because he'd been sent out moments earlier to fetch supper. In another building, a woman named Elizabeth Smith and her 4-year-old son were crushed beneath the collapse of a house wall, brought down by the surge. Across the street, a group of mourners had gathered to hold a wake for a 2-year-old child who had died of illness. Before the prayers could even begin, the flood hit. The floor gave way. The room collapsed. 4 women and a child were instantly killed. In total, 8 people lost their lives that evening, not in fire, not in war, but in a bizarre industrial accident involving beer. And dozens more were injured, displaced, or left with nothing but soaked rubble. But the tragedy didn't stop there. In the hours that followed, the air in St. Giles filled with the sour, choking smell of warm porter. Bodies lay beneath ruins. The beer pooled in basements, mixing with mud, dust, and debris. Some survivors tried to salvage what they could: clothes, blankets, furniture now soaked and useless. Others tried to salvage the beer. There were reports of people using pots, pans, and even had to scoop it from the streets. Some drank directly from the gutters, believing it would be wasteful to let good alcohol go to, well, waste. But even this became a source of danger. In the following days, more people died not from drowning but from alcohol poisoning. Having consumed too much of the spilled beer, a tragedy turned into a farce turned deadly. And yet, despite the devastation, no one was arrested, no one was fined, and no one, not even the brewery, was held accountable. Because, legally, the beer flood was ruled an act of God, no joke. As far as the courts were concerned, the collapse of a massive vat of beer was as unpredictable as an earthquake or a bolt of lightning. And that was that. The families of the dead received no compensation. The Mo Brewery even applied for a refund from the government for the lost beer and got it. The morning after the flood, the streets of St. Giles were eerily quiet. The beer had drained away or soaked into the earth, but its aftermath lingered physically, emotionally, and politically. What remained were broken homes, mourning families, and a neighborhood reeking of stale porter. 8 people had died, several more were injured, and entire households were destroyed. But when it came time to assign blame, no one was held responsible. The Mo Brewery, whose vat had exploded, never faced charges. The inquest into the disaster concluded that the tragedy had been a visitation of God. That's right, not an accident, not negligence, not even bad engineering, just divine will. The ruling, astonishing as it sounds, wasn't unusual for the time. In early 19th century England, industrial accidents were often considered natural tragedies unless clear malice or criminal intent could be proven. The brewery argued that the vat had passed inspection, that no one could have predicted such a rupture, that the design met existing safety standards, whatever those were in 1814. And so, the legal system shrugged. Meanwhile, the victims' families, poor, working class, and mostly invisible to the upper echelons of London society, received no compensation. There was no state assistance, no insurance payouts, no corporate apologies. Some families resorted to public donations, setting up makeshift collections at local taverns, churches, and market stalls, hoping strangers would help bury their dead. A few wealthier citizens donated out of sympathy, but many others simply mocked the victims, seeing them as drunkards who had gotten what they deserved in some cosmic joke of irony. And then came the newspapers. Some reported the story with solemnity, others turned it into a circus. Cartoons were printed of beer waves sweeping away lazy Londoners, satirical poems made light of the drownings. One pamphlet mockingly titled the event the Great Porter Flood, London's tastiest disaster. For the Mo Brewery, the consequences were minimal. They lost thousands of barrels of beer, yes, but they didn't lose reputation. In fact, in the bizarre logic of early capitalism, the flood gave them free publicity. People across the city started talking about Mo Porter, some with horror, others with curiosity. And business, it boomed. They applied for a tax refund for the beer lost in the flood, and the government granted it, amounting to several £1,000s. With that, the brewery repaired its vats, reinforced the structure, and resumed production like nothing had happened. No reform was passed, no new regulation enforced, no memorial built for the dead. The flood was already becoming a footnote 10 absurdity rather than a tragedy, and that's how history quietly closed the barrel. Today, if you walk through Tottenham Court Road, you won't see any plaque. There's no statue, no commemorative mural. The buildings are modern, the streets are busy, and the only hint of what once happened there is buried in old archives and the occasional trivia blog. The London beer flood has all but vanished from the city's collective memory. And maybe that's because it's too absurd to grieve, too tragic to laugh at, and too uncomfortable to confront. After all, what does it say about society when 8 people die? And the biggest response is a tax break for the business that caused it for decades. Historians barely mention the event, even local museums skipped over it. Only in recent years has the story resurfaced, usually framed as a quirky historical oddity. Did you know people once drowned in beer? Cue the chuckles. But if we look closer, the flood reveals deeper truths. It's a story about industrial negligence, happening before anyone even called it that. It's a story about class division, where the lives of the poor were literally washed away without consequence. And it's a story about how history chooses what to remember and what to laugh off. There are also strange rumors that linger. Some say the neighborhood was haunted for years by the scent of stale beer. Others claim bodies were found weeks later, wedged into forgotten corners of cellars. One urban legend even insists a pub was built on the exact spot, and cellar floods mysteriously every October. Probably nonsense, but it says something that the mythology of the flood outlived. The memory, the Mo Brewery, for its part, continued to operate for another century, eventually closing in the 20th century as beer production evolved. No further floods occurred, at least none that made the headlines. In the end, the London beer flood stands as one of history's most surreal disasters, caught somewhere between tragedy and parody, folklore and fact. And maybe that's why it still fascinates, because it reminds us that history isn't always written in blood. Sometimes it's written in beer. That's it for today's Forgotten Tale. If this story made you raise an eyebrow don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that dusty little bell so you never miss another echo from the past. Drop it in the comments, we're always listening for new echoes. Got a weird bit of history you think we should cover? Until next time, keep your curiosity loud and your history weird. That's it.